Lord, guide us as we talk about you today. Today we're not necessarily going through your word, but we will be talking about various different things that are found in Scripture, God. And we will be talking about the evidence that we have to believe that you did resurrect from the dead. The very event on which our hope and our faith relies, God. And so please give us sober minds as we approach this. Let us not allow our biases to shape our convictions, God, but rather let us simply follow the truth where the truth leads. And may we be content to follow the truth where the truth leads and rejoice whenever we see that it actually does point in favor of what we do believe. We love you, God. Help us love you more. We praise you, God. Help us praise you more. We seek to glorify you, God. Help us seek to glorify you more. Work on our hearts today and not simply our minds. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so we are currently in a series basically where we are talking about the case for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we are not simply approaching this from a theological perspective. We're not simply approaching this from a scientific perspective. We are approaching this from a historical perspective, where we are looking at the historical evidence that we have pertaining to the resurrection of Jesus, and we are seeing whether or not we have good reason to believe that he did historically resurrect from the dead. As Christians, obviously, we want this to have happened. Because if Jesus didn't resurrect from the dead, there are a lot of scary implications that would really suggest that we should not be Christians at all. We should close our churches. We should stop gathering together, so on and so forth. And so we do have a bias here, right? We do want this to be true, but we don't want to blindly believe that, right? We want to examine the evidence, and we want to go where the truth leads. And so what we're going to do is we're just looking at the different things that are found in Scripture, that are found outside of Scripture, and we are basically trying to figure out what evidence we have to believe whether or not, like just about Jesus, right? Did he die? Did he resurrect? How do we know that? And what we're doing is we're basically looking at 5 different facts that pretty much every historian agrees about. All right, so the thing we talked about last week, the thing we're talking about this week, and the things we're going to continue talking about over the next few weeks are not things that are really up for debate, right? There's going to be some people who debate about them just because there are some people who just are contrarian and they love to just believe very strange theories. But by and large, the things we're talking about are not up for debate because we are simply talking about events that practically every historian agrees about. The thing that's going to be up for debate is the conclusion we come to at the end, right? Because we're looking at 5 facts that everybody agrees about, but people come to different conclusions about those 5 facts. So who remembers what the fact we talked about last week was? What was the very first thing we said?
And that was last week, right?
Yes.
The very first thing.
Yes.
Is it resurrection?
We're examining the evidence for the resurrection, but the first fact we talked about was, anybody know? It was more of a gruesome week.
Crucifixion.
We talked about crucifixion, right? And that's because fact number 1 that practically every historian agrees about Jesus in regards to his death is that he died a death by crucifixion, right? Practically every historian agrees that, whether they're Christian, atheist, agnostic, Buddhist, Hindu, Zoroastrian, whatever, right? Any historian who has seriously looked into the evidence agrees Jesus died a death by crucifixion. That obviously does not prove he resurrected. It simply proves that he died, which is a necessary precursor to resurrection, right? You can't resurrect unless you die first. And so that's kind of a good place to start. And right off the bat, that kind of it rules out certain theories that some people propose, right? Some people suggest that Jesus simply passed out on the cross and that he didn't actually die. Well, there's no historical evidence for that, right? Because we talked about last week that every single account that we have about Jesus tells us that he died, right? That he was murdered and that he was sentenced to death, right? Every evidence that we have tells us that. And there's even other evidence that tells us that it is very improbable that somebody who was crucified was to survive, right? We literally only have one account in all history of somebody surviving crucifixion, and that was when 3 people were immediately taken off a cross, and then they were given the best medical care, and even then, only 1 of 3 of them survived, right? And so what we talked about last week was just the evidence for that, right? We have very good reason to believe Jesus died a death by crucifixion, and whenever people argue anything otherwise, they're arguing against history, right? They are simply speculating. They are simply becoming conspiracy theorists. They are not being historical, right? The historical evidence tells us he died a death by crucifixion, right? We're all clear on that?
Yes.
Cool. That was last week. that leads us to fact number 2, which we're talking about this week, which is ladies discovering the empty tomb. Right? Practically every historian will agree that come Sunday morning, a group of women discovered a tomb that they believed to be Jesus's empty. Again, that does not prove that Jesus resurrected. It simply proves that come Sunday morning, a group of women found a tomb that they believed to be Jesus's empty. There's other explanations you could give, right? You could argue that they went to the wrong tomb. That's possible, right? You could argue that somebody stole the body. That's also possible, right? So there's plenty of theories that could explain this, but we're not coming to the conclusion about the resurrection based off one fact. We're simply looking at the things that we know to be true based off of the historical evidence, and we're going to come to our conclusion at the very end. Does that make sense? All right. So today we're going to talk about why do we believe this to be true? What evidence do we have that would lead us to think that this actually happened? Right? How do we know that they weren't just making this up? Right? The gospel accounts tell us that women found the tomb empty, but what if they were just making it up? Well, no, there is evidence within there which would suggest to us that this was, in fact, true. And so, first off, we have to start by asking a question. Was the tomb empty at all? Right? Before we even talk about the matter of women, we need to ask, was the tomb empty? Right? It doesn't matter who discovered the tomb empty if the tomb itself is not empty. Right? So, all 4 gospel accounts record that when the women came to visit the tomb on Sunday morning, they found it empty. However, Christians were not the only ones to agree that the tomb was empty. If you go to the end of the Gospel of Matthew, this is what we read in chapter 28. Actually, can I get one of y'all to read that, the gray text, for me?
Can I?
Yes, go for it.
Now while the women were on their way, behold, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and took counsel together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, "You are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this is heard before the governor, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble." And they took the money and did as they had been instructed. And this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day.
Very good. Thank you. All right, so there's Matthew chapter 28. The main thing I want to highlight there is the reaction to the tomb being empty. Right? What we see here is not supporters of Jesus saying the tomb is empty. Who's saying the tomb is empty here?
A guard.
It's the guards and the chief priests. They're responding to it, right? These are people who do not want the tomb to be empty, but they're reacting to it being empty. And you could argue here, oh, well, maybe Matthew just made up this story to make it seem more likely that the tomb was actually empty. We'll talk about that again in a second, right? Because there's actually evidence within this which would suggest to us that that's not what Matthew did. Right off the bat, let me see if I can kind of test y'all a little bit. Is there anything that you see within this text which would seem to suggest that Matthew didn't simply make this up?
The ending that says, "and is to this day."
Yes. Why does that suggest that it's not made up?
Because you could easily see it in the present because it's still happening.
Yes. Very good. What were you going to say, Brian?
I was going to say that you could go to people, like, at the time and ask for, like, a testimony of it.
Exactly. Right? So Matthew, he ends that by saying that this story was widely spread amongst the Jews and is to this day, which implies that Matthew expects the audience reading his gospel to be familiar with this story. And so the only thing, like, there's a way to disprove what Matthew is saying here. His audience could read this, and they could go find a group of Jewish people and say, "Hey, have you ever heard this story being reported?" And the people would say, "No. In fact, we know exactly where Jesus is buried. It's right here." Right? And so if you're trying to fabricate a lie, you don't include a phrase like that. Right? What you would say is, "Oh yeah, they spread this lie, and that's why nobody talks about Jesus anymore." Right? You would say something to make it harder to disprove. But instead, Matthew almost challenges his readers. Like, it's almost like Matthew is writing to Jewish people, and he says, "Hey, I bet you've heard this theory going around that the body of Jesus was stolen. Well, there's an explanation for that." And he gives the explanation. And so, if Matthew's audience has actually heard that this theory is the one being proposed, that means that there was a genuine movement that was claiming that the body had been stolen. And the only reason people would claim the body had been stolen is because the tomb was empty. Does that make sense? Right? If the tomb was not in fact empty, then why would the adversaries of Jesus spread a lie about the body being stolen? If anything, they're just giving credit to the apostles, right? Because they're actually almost giving, like, adding fuel to the fire of the Jesus movement, right? And so little details like that are really cool for historians because they're like, that's really great, right? But let's go beyond that. While this does not confirm the resurrection, it would nevertheless seem to confirm that the tomb was in fact empty, despite the fact that guards were placed in front of it, as we read at the end of Matthew chapter 27. Because if not, the body of Jesus would have been retrieved to prove that it was still dead, right? There is a very easy way to disprove the resurrection of Jesus. Present a body, right? If you're going to say that the women went to the wrong tomb, well, the easiest thing that the chief priest could have done is go take the body out of the right tomb and present it, right? They'd say, okay, the women, they were grief-stricken, they accidentally went to the wrong tomb. Well, we placed guards at the correct tomb, and the body's in there, right? That would have been an easy way to prove that the women were wrong. But they didn't do that. Instead, the chief priests, they basically bribed the guards to go spread this lie, right? And they said, just go tell everybody that, the body was stolen. But there's also some stuff that, just within here, that's kind of funny. Do you notice what's kind of weird about the lie that the chief priests asked the guards to spread? What do they tell them to say?
His disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep.
What's faulty with that logic?
There are guards placed in front of the tomb.
Okay.
I wonder if the guards would ever fall asleep because they're used to their job.
Okay. Well, no, that's true.
Oh, while we were
That's the
asleep.
answer.
Oh,
Yes.
I get it.
No, but what's faulty with that logic?
Because there's guards at the tomb. How could they get into the tomb to
Technically,
get?
they could just wake up.
Yeah.
Think a little deeper. What is at fault with the logic of this lie?
Wow.
You decide the fact you sit on the body.
Okay, I'll just give you the answer. How do you know that somebody stole a body if you were asleep at the time?
Yeah, I was trying to.
Came to me in a dream.
Right? Think about it. Think about it. You are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. If you were asleep, you would not know that. Right? Basically what you're saying is we were asleep, and whenever we went to sleep, the tomb was filled, and when we woke up, the tomb was empty. That doesn't, you can't prove that the disciples stole it. You're just saying that the tomb was empty. Right? Because if you're asleep, you literally would not know the disciples stole the body. And if you were awake enough to see the disciples coming and doing it, you would have gotten up and stopped them. And so the lie literally does not make sense.
Yeah.
Right? But this is what the scribes are having to do to try to suppress this. Whereas, once again, if the tomb was not empty, all you have to do is provide a body. Right? But instead, this is the best they have to do. And apparently this was such a widespread lie that Matthew expects his audience to be familiar with it, or he expects them to be able to ask people about it. Right? So he's challenging them. Go look. Right? Go ask. Yeah. This is somewhat like how the Jewish people reacted to Jesus' miracles. They did not deny the reality, but tried to attribute them to demons. Right? This is something that we see throughout Jesus' ministry. Right? Throughout Jesus' ministry, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, there's never a single time where somebody denies that Jesus was able to perform a miracle. Right? Nowadays, people do that. Right? Nowadays, people are like, oh, I'm sure that, Jesus didn't actually walk on water. He probably just walked on a sandbar or something like that. Right? They'll make up stuff, right? Because nowadays, we live in a very skeptical age where, if somebody does something that looks miraculous, we attribute it to Photoshop. Right? And people nowadays, 2,000 years removed from the event, they'll look back at what Jesus did and they'll say, I'm sure it wasn't a miracle. It was probably like a trick of the lighting or something. But in the Gospels, nobody does that. Even the people who oppose Jesus, they don't deny that he does these things. Right? Every single one of them admits he does miracles. They simply disagree about how he does the miracles. Right? They say that he doesn't do them by the power of God. He does them by the power of demons. And so I just think that's very interesting that even throughout the Gospels, nobody can deny Jesus' power. Same thing with his resurrection. Nobody denies the tomb is empty. They simply debate about how the tomb became empty. And so, 2,000 years later, you have some people who will come up with theories saying, oh, the women went to the wrong tomb. Okay, you're not being historical, right? Because our earliest historical evidence shows that everybody agreed the tomb was empty, right? So if you're going to argue that the women went to the wrong tomb, you're just making stuff up. Don't call yourself a historian, right? Because historians, they don't exist to speculate. They exist to come to conclusions based off of the evidence, right? And so you cannot say that the women went to the wrong tomb based off historical evidence. You can only say that based off of speculation. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, so let's continue. This is where we're going to address what I've already kind of given you all a little glimpse at so far, right? Couldn't Matthew be lying? Couldn't he have made up these details in order to better defend the resurrection? I've already talked about this, but what I want to do is I want to more exhaustively look at it just to show you how it's just unlikely that Matthew made this stuff up, right? Because that's really important, right? We don't want to simply say, oh, it's in the Gospel of Matthew, therefore it's true. As Christians, we can do that, but once again, we're trying to set our Christian beliefs over here, and we're just trying to look at this objectively, right? And so, why do we have reason to believe Matthew's telling the truth? Some of the stuff we're going to say here is stuff that I've already told you. Firstly, if Matthew was fabricating a stolen body theory, then his original audience would know. He mentions that the lie had continued to this day, implying that his original audience was familiar with it from a source other than him, namely, Jews who were opposed to Jesus. If his original audience had never heard of this, they could have called his bluff, right? We've already talked about that part. Everybody's good on that? Okay. Secondly, Matthew had no reason to fabricate a lie, for the resurrection is supported by more than simply the empty tomb, such as resurrection appearances. That's what we're going to be talking about when it comes to fact number 3, right? Fabricating such a lie would be an unnecessary complication, trusting that those Jews who were opposed to Christianity would simply go along with the lie rather than guiding someone to a non-empty tomb. Think about the logic of that real quick, right? Does Matthew need to make up a lie in order to prove that the tomb was empty? No, right? Because if you're suggesting that Jesus resurrected, doesn't that already imply that the tomb was empty? Right? Like, think about it, right? The gospel accounts and 1 Corinthians tell us that Jesus appeared to people on several occasions. Okay, if Jesus showed up alive after being dead, that would already imply that the tomb was empty, yes?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So Matthew doesn't need to prove the tomb is empty because it's just implied by the means of resurrection. And so, fabricating a lie about the empty tomb, that would just be unnecessarily complicating things, right? Because now he's going out of his way, hypothetically, right? This is what skeptics say. Like, they'll say, oh, Matthew just made this up to give it credibility. It doesn't really give that much credibility if he's lying, though. Because if he's making up this lie, all you have to do is go ask around. And you have to say, hey, have you ever heard the chief priest claiming that the body was stolen? And then somebody would say, no, the chief priests have never said that. And then that would disprove Matthew's theory immediately. And so Matthew doesn't have much to gain by saying this. And he has everything to lose if he's making it up. Does that make sense? Right? And so like now, 2,000 years later, this is really good evidence for us. But for Matthew back then, it's not like it really added that much to the resurrection hypothesis. Right? He's simply saying how things were, and to make up this whole conspiracy theory by the chief priests would unnecessarily complicate things, because why would the chief priests agree to this? Right? If the chief priests were not spreading this lie, and then somebody came up and asked them, it's not like they would just be like, oh yeah, well if Matthew says we were doing it, then yeah, we're doing it. No, the chief priests do not want Jesus to be alive. And so, if they heard this whole lie being spread about, they'd say, no, we didn't do that. What are you talking about? We don't even care about this Jesus guy. Right? And so it would seem to suggest that this did actually happen. Thirdly, if Matthew was fabricating such a lie, it would not be for apologetic purposes. Once again, what does apologetic mean?
Defending of the faith.
Defending the faith. Right? So if he's fabricating such a lie, it's not simply because he's defending the resurrection. Right? Because early Christians did not use the empty tomb as proof for the resurrection. Right? Whenever you look elsewhere throughout the Bible, in the New Testament, and into the early church, there's never a single point where Christians say, you know how I know that the resurrection happened? Because the tomb was empty. Right? That's what we say nowadays, 2,000 years later. But when you look at the early church, that's not what they allude to. Right? When you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which is a verse that we're going to be talking about a whole lot through this series, Paul does not say that Jesus died according to the Scriptures, that he was buried according to the Scriptures, and that he exited the grave according to the Scriptures. And no, he says he died, he was buried, he was raised, and he appeared to so-and-so, 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 and so-and-so. Right? So whenever you look at the early church, the things that they cite to prove the resurrection are the appearances of Jesus to people. Right? They don't mention the empty tomb. Right? And so, if Matthew is detailing this here, it doesn't seem like it's him trying to prove anything, because that's not evidence that the early church used. Firstly, it was easily falsifiable, hence the plethora of theories concerning how it could have happened. Right? The reason why I say it's easily falsifiable is because there's several reasons why a tomb could be empty. Right? You could say, once again, they went to the wrong tomb. You could say that the body was stolen. You could say that, I don't know, they had to take the body out temporarily in order to do some renovations, right? You could say that for some reason the tomb spontaneously exploded, right? You could come up with endless theories for why the tomb would be empty, and so the empty tomb alone does not prove somebody resurrected, right? If you were to go to the nearest cemetery and there was a tomb that you found empty, would you just assume that that person rose from the grave? No, right? You would need a little bit more evidence than that to think that they resurrected, right? And so there's not enough weight falling upon the empty tomb itself to necessitate Matthew fabricating such a lie. Secondly, if Jews in AD 30 didn't believe it, why would readers decades later be less skeptical? Thirdly, eyewitness accounts of the resurrected Jesus were relied upon far more often, and the empty tomb is implicit to such accounts. Why fabricate a lie which would be apologetically unnecessary and unhelpful? Everybody gets that?
Yes.
Okay. Next. If the Jews were actually telling people that the body had been stolen, that would seem to prove that the tomb was in fact empty. If not, we'd have to wonder why the Jews would lie, since doing so gave credibility to the theory that they were trying to suppress, that Jesus had risen. Right? If they're going around saying, hey guys, the disciples stole the body, that just implies that the tomb is empty. Right? That's just, once again, doesn't imply the resurrection, but they would have no reason to spread this lie unless the tomb was empty. Fifthly, Jesus' disciples began to publicly proclaim Christ's resurrection at Pentecost less than 2 months after the public execution and burial in Jerusalem. If the tomb was not empty, there were plenty of people who should have been able to demonstrate as much. Jesus' enemies had every reason to produce his body if it could indeed be found. Right? This is super important to recognize. Right? Whenever you get to Acts chapter 2 and you see Peter preaching this amazing sermon, what city is he preaching in?
Is it Jerusalem?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
He's preaching in Jerusalem. What city was Jesus crucified in?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. What city was Jesus buried in?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Right? That all happened around Passover. And Peter is preaching around Pentecost. That's 50 days later. That's a month and a half. Right? 1.5 months have passed since Jesus died and supposedly resurrected. And then Peter is standing there publicly proclaiming to everybody that Jesus died and resurrected. If the tomb was not empty, you know what people would have to do? Just go pull up the tomb. Right? But instead, what we read in Acts chapter 2 is that thousands of people came to Christ. And nobody showed up and produced a body of Jesus. And as you keep reading through Acts, a lot of that happens in the early months of the church. There's nobody who says, oh man, well, you know what will really suppress this Christian movement? We just need to go dig up the body of Jesus and produce it. Nobody does that. Right? The only thing that they can do is, remember when Gamaliel speaks up in Acts? He says, if this is from God, there's nothing that can stop it. If it's not from God, it'll die out on its own. Right? That's how Gamaliel says they should handle it. But nobody says, hey, let's go roll open that stone and grab the actual body. Which would seem to imply that there was no body to produce. Right? It just implies the tomb is empty. Further, the stolen body theory is the only early opposing theory that we know of to be offered by Jesus' enemies. That's super important to recognize. Right? Nowadays, whenever people talk about arguments against the resurrection of Jesus, there are so many theories, dozens of theories. Right? Like I mentioned, there's the swoon theory. Right? There's the idea that he just passed out on the cross. There's the twin theory, the idea, and this goes different ways. Right? One twin theory is that Jesus died on the cross, but he actually had a long-lost twin who showed up and, he just took Jesus' place and acted like Jesus resurrected. And then another version of the twin theory is that shortly before Jesus was going to be crucified, they switched him out with somebody else. And he died on the cross in Jesus' place, and that's how Jesus showed up later. Right? And then you have the stolen body theory, right? And then you have the wrong tomb theory, where the women went to the wrong tomb. You also have the hallucination theory, the idea that the tomb was in fact full, but people just had hallucinations of Jesus, right? There's so many dozens of theories that people have made. There's literally alien theories, right? There are theories that involve aliens in this whole thing. It's crazy, right?
Fiction.
So there are dozens of theories nowadays in regards to what happened. But if you actually go back to the first century, there's only one theory, and it's the most simple one. The body was stolen. Because really, those are, like, if you're thinking about it, all the other theories, those are stretches, right? The simplest theory is that the body was stolen, right? If Jesus resurrected, okay, well, that explains why the tomb is empty. If Jesus didn't resurrect, well, the next easiest answer is that somebody stole the body, right? And sure enough, that's what you see in the early church, right? The only thing that we see skeptics arguing is that the body was stolen. You don't have anybody saying, oh, there's a secret twin and stuff. That's what people do nowadays, 2,000 years later, because they want to deny the fact, right? But you got to realize that theory is the only one that people in the first century actually offered. Therefore, while this does not confirm the resurrection, it does give us good reason to believe that the tomb was indeed empty. But we can go beyond that, right? Not only was the tomb empty, that in and of itself, we could say, is a bedrock fact. But we can actually be more specific. We can actually say that ladies discovered the empty tomb, right? We can say exactly who were the people to come across the tomb when it was empty. And that might not sound super important to y'all when you first hear it, but the fact that it's a little bit more detailed means that we can have a little bit more confidence in the sequence of events and the nature of what was happening here. Right? And so from a historical perspective, that's really useful. Right? It's one thing to say that there's an empty tomb, but it's another thing to say exactly who discovered that empty tomb. Right? So, all four Gospels report that women were the first to discover the tomb of Jesus. Since there are four of y'all in here, do you think I could get one of y'all each to read one of these? Alright. Can we start with Brianne here, and then we'll work our way around?
Now after the Sabbath, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended and said to the woman, Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who has been crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, just as he said. Come to the place where he is lying.
All right.
Matthew 28:6.
Perfect. Thank you. Alright, so in Matthew, who are the people who come and see the tomb?
Mary and the other Mary.
Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Right? Alright, there we go. And it says it's after the Sabbath, right? So this would be on Sunday now. The Sabbath is Saturday. It's now on Sunday. They show up. They find the tomb empty. Alright, let's read the Gospel of Mark. George?
Mark.
Yep.
And when the Sabbath passed, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, brought spices so that they might come and anoint him. And the angel said to them, Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Behold, the place where they laid him.
Alright, cool. So in Mark's account, who shows up at the tomb?
Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James.
And
Sounds
Salome,
Oh.
right?
Salome.
So this is actually really useful for us, right? Matthew's account only lists how many women? Two. How many does Mark's list?
3.
3. Okay, now some people look at that and they say, it's a contradiction. That's not necessarily a contradiction, right? There's a difference between a contradiction and a discrepancy, right? A contradiction is when two things cannot be true at the same time, right? If I were to say, this shirt is green, and then I also say, this shirt is not green, that is a contradiction,
Yeah.
right? Because those cannot be true at the same time. However, if you say, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary showed up at the tomb, and then you say Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, and Salome showed up at the tomb, that's not a contradiction. One just leaves it out, right? If somebody were to ask me later, hey, who was that discipleship group? And I'd say, well, George was there today. Okay, cool. But then if somebody else were to ask me and I said, well, there was Paul, and there was Ben, and there was George and Brianne. Now, were either of those lies? No, right? I just shared more details, and there might be different reasons for why I shared those details, right? Because maybe somebody knew that George was not there the previous week or something like that, and therefore, when they said, who was that discipleship group? Well, that's why I mentioned George in particular, right? And so there could be various different reasons as to why you would only share certain people.
Yes.
But that's not a contradiction, right? And some people will like say that in regards to this same scene, because in one scene it'll say there was an angel who spoke to them. And then another one it'll say there were two angels there. And people will say, that's a contradiction. It's not a contradiction. It's simply a discrepancy, right? More likely what happened is that there were two angels, but only one spoke, right? And so it's just a matter of how you tell a story, right? And this is true anytime, right? Like there's times I've told stories and you just change the details you share. The reason why this is good for us is because it shows that when Matthew and Mark were writing, they were not going out of their way to make sure that their accounts were exactly the same, right? Because that would give skeptical people more reason to be skeptical, right? Because if their details were exactly the same and they referred to everybody by the exact same terms and they listed them in the same order and stuff like that, it would almost seem like they had gotten together and were like, hey, you make sure you mention this, I'll make sure I mention the same thing, everybody will fall for it, right? That's what it would make it seem like. But that's evidently not what happened, right? Matthew wrote his account, Mark wrote his account, and they weren't trying to force them to line up, they were simply reporting the details that they felt were relevant. But what they agree on is that on Sunday morning, right, the day after the Sabbath, there were some women, and they discovered the empty tomb, right? All right, let's read Luke's account.
Luke 24, 1-6. Now on the first day of the week, at early dawn, the women came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. The angel said to them, why do you seek the living one among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen.
Perfect, thank you. And so right there, you'll see that I have the women in brackets, and that's because it doesn't actually say the women there in Luke 24. You have to go to the end of Luke 23 for those details, right? Luke 23 ends by saying this, and behold, a man named Joseph, who was a council member, a good and righteous man. He had not consented to their counsel and action. A man from Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who was waiting for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And he took it down and wrapped it in linen cloth, and laid him in a tomb cut into the rock where no one had ever lain. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. Now the women who had come with him from Galilee followed and beheld the tomb and how his body was laid. Then after they returned, they prepared spices and perfumes, and on the Sabbath day they rested according to the commandment. Right? So Luke 23 ends by talking about the women specifically following Joseph of Arimathea to the tomb. Right? And they see where Jesus is buried. And then, that's on Friday, on the Sabbath day they rest. And then it says, now on the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb. Who is they? The women. Right? And so this one doesn't specifically identify who the women are. It just simply says it was the group of women who had been following him from Galilee. Well, if you go a little bit earlier in the Gospel of Luke, it tells you who some of these women are. Guess who one of them is? Mary Magdalene. Right? And so Mary Magdalene, you'll notice, shows up in every single one of those accounts. And then we get to the Gospel of John. Read that one for us.
Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark and saw the stone already taken away from the tomb.
Okay, perfect. So who's the only person who's mentioned there?
Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene. Okay, well this seems to make sense actually, right? It doesn't mention the other women, and it could be that the women were there, it could be that they were not there, but the main thing is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all agree that at least one person was there. Who was it?
Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene. But then whenever you look at all four of them together, it would seem to suggest that there were some others there, one other of whom was named Mary, another one who might have been Salome, and then maybe even some more women beyond that, right? But Mary Magdalene seems to be the one who's at the forefront of all of these stories, which is really interesting because throughout the rest of the Gospels, Mary Magdalene is not a very prominent figure, right? Really, the only other thing we know about Mary Magdalene beyond this story right here is that she was a follower of Jesus who helped support him and that she had 7 demons cast out of her. That's literally it. We don't really know much about Mary Magdalene beyond this. I know those who watch The Chosen think that Mary Magdalene is like some primary character in the Gospels, but she isn't. The main claim to fame of Mary Magdalene is that every single one of the Gospels present her as the first person to encounter the empty tomb. And in the Gospel of John, she's the very first person to encounter the risen Jesus. Right? So that's kind of cool. But all because the Gospels mention that women found the empty tomb, that doesn't necessarily prove that they found the empty tomb, right? You could always argue, well, maybe the Gospels were fabricating this too, right? Even if the tomb was empty, maybe it's fabricating who discovered the empty tomb. But we actually have historical evidence that would suggest that that also is false. And really, it comes down to the culture at that time period, right? Whenever you're looking at the culture of first century Israel, there's really two different cultures you have to consider. What two cultures do you have to consider? Like the people.
Cultural knowledge.
Okay, so there's the Jewish culture, and then for the Gentile culture, who are you mainly considering?
Roman.
Romans, right? The Jewish culture and the Roman culture. What we're going to do real quick is we are going to go look at some certain aspects of the Roman culture and the Jewish culture, specifically in how they viewed women at this time period. And we're going to see that whenever you look at the Greco-Roman and Jewish views of women, and then you look at the gospel accounts, that would actually give us evidence to suggest that what the gospel accounts are recording here is actual historical events, not simply a fabricated lie. Right? And you'll understand why that's relevant in a little bit. So, firstly, in the Greco-Roman world, women were viewed as more gullible when it came to religious matters, prone to superstition, and excessive in their religious practices. Right? It's safe to say that Greco-Roman people did not have a very high opinion of women. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually look at some examples of this. Right? So, this is from Plutarch in De Pythiae Oraculis. He says this: however, the thing that most filled the poetic art with disrepute was the tribe of wandering soothsayers and rogues that practiced their charlatanry about the shrines of the Great Mother and of Serapis, making up oracles, some using their own ingenuity, others taking by lot from certain treatises oracles of the benefit of servants and of womenfolk, who are most enticed by verse and a poetic vocabulary. This, then, is not the least among the reasons why poetry, by apparently lending herself to her service of tricksters, mountebanks, and false prophets, lost all standing with truth and the tripod. All right. So what we see here is a certain characterization of how this culture views women. Right? How do they view women here? What does it say there?
Enticed.
They're easily enticed by what? Verse and poetic vocabulary, right? What they're saying is that women are very easily emotionally manipulated, right? As long as you can just string some poetic words together and you can make some words rhyme, you can get women to believe anything, right? Once again, I'm not saying that's what I believe. I'm saying that's what they believed back here. And you could say that this was just an exception to the rule, but what we're going to see is that we have several examples that this is just in general how people viewed women back in that time period. I'm not saying it's correct. I'm just saying that, in general, there was a lower view of women than there were of men, which is going to have an effect on how we view the testimony of the Gospels here. Right? Let's look at this. This is from Juvenal in the Satires. As the name implies, this guy is kind of making fun of things, the Satires. He's talking about women. In winter she'll break the ice and submerge herself in the river, dipping herself 3 times in the Tiber at dawn, even plunging her fearful head in the swirling waters, and, naked and shivering, she'll crawl across our proud King Tarquin's Campus Martius on blood-stained knees, and then, if white Io should command, she'll journey to the far bounds of Egypt and bring back water from sweltering Meroe to sprinkle around in the temple of Isis that looms by the campus polling booths, the ancient sheepfold. Indeed, she believes she's ruled by the voice of the lady herself, hers being the kind of mind and spirit the gods speak to at night. If her eye corner itches when rubbed, she checks her horoscope before seeking relief. If she's lying in bed ill, the hour appropriate for taking food, it seems, must be one prescribed by that Egyptian Perosiris. If she's middle class, she'll try the fortune tellers at the circus, select the cards, or offer her hand and brow to the prophet who demands of her lots of clicking sounds with the tongue. So what this dude is saying, he's basically mocking women, right? He's mocking how gullible women are, and he's saying women are so easily manipulated. He says they just fall for anything, right? They will do whatever it takes to get what they want, and they will fall for any sort of superstition, any sort of religion. They'll do anything, right? Look at some of the examples he says. right? In winter, she'll break the ice and submerge herself in the river, dipping herself 3 times in the Tiber at dawn, even plunging her fearful head in the swirling waters and naked and shivering. He says, yeah, if you can convince the girl that it's worth it or that one of the gods demands this of her, she'll just take off all her clothes and go naked into a river, even if it's freezing cold. And she'll do it 3 times because that's how dumb they are, right? He's making fun of her. Once again, this is the satires. So he probably didn't believe it to this extreme, but most jokes have a layer of truth to them, right? And so he's openly mocking women here, and he just says that they'll just fall for anything, right? She'll crawl across our proud King Tarquin's Campus Martius on blood-stained knees, and then if white Io should command, she'll journey to the far bounds of Egypt and bring back water from sweltering Meroe to sprinkle around the temple of Isis, right? The idea is that if a king commands her to do so, she'll crawl across the palace until her knees are bleeding, right? If she thinks that a god has told her to, she will literally travel across the desert just to get some water and bring it back to the god, right? It's just like he's intentionally coming up with really silly situations, right? If her eye corner itches, right? So if she has a slight itch in her eye, right, she'll start panicking, right? And she'll think that she's about to die or something. So if her eye corner itches when rubbed, she checks her horoscope before seeking relief, right? Y'all know what a horoscope is, right? It's people talk about like Gemini and Cancer and stuff like that. It's just superstitious stuff, right? You're like, oh, I'm going to see where the moon is aligning and stuff like that, and like all because she had a slight itch in her eye, she'll think that like the gods are trying to communicate to her or something. He's basically just saying that women are very easily manipulated when it comes to religion, emotion, anything, that they will literally fall for anything and everything. And it doesn't simply belong to the upper class women. It's anybody. If she's middle class, she'll try the fortune tellers at the circus, select the cards, offer her hand to brow to the prophet who demands of her lots of clicking sounds with the tongue. Right? She'll go to the circus just because she wants to know what her future holds, and she'll let them read the palms, and she'll dance around on one leg, clicking her tongue, and just making a fool of herself just to impress people, right? And just because she wants some sort of message from the gods. Again, this is the satires, so he's most likely he's exaggerating here, but in general it shows that this is what people viewed women to be. Let's talk about another example. This is from Celsus apud Origen. But as Celsus, so this is Origen writing. Origen was actually an early church father. But as Celsus delights to heap up calumnies against us, let us examine these also, and see whether it be the Christians or Celsus who have reason to be ashamed of what is said. Right? So Origen is talking about this guy named Celsus who basically was opposed to Christianity, and he's about to summarize what Celsus typically said. We see indeed in private houses workers in wool and leather, and fullers, and persons of the most uninstructed and rustic character, not venturing to utter a word in the presence of their elders and wiser masters. But when they get hold of the children privately, and certain women as ignorant as themselves, they pour forth wonderful statements to the effect that they ought not to give heed to their father and to their teachers, but should obey them, that the former and foolish are and stupid, and neither know can perform anything that is really good, being preoccupied with empty trifles, that they alone know how men ought to live, and that if the children obey them, they will both be happy themselves and will make their home happy also. So, what Celsus is saying here is that in general, he seems to have a negative view of people of a certain occupation, right? This is probably what we would call blue-collar workers, right? If you, like a blue-collar worker, these are manual laborers, right? These are people like, just like construction workers and stuff like that. So Celsus, he says that in general, he thinks that laborers aren't very smart. And so they recognize they're not very smart, and therefore they'll keep a lot of their opinions to themselves whenever they're around people who are more learned, right? Such as their elders, or scribes, or religious people, right? The laborers, they know to keep their opinions to themselves when they're around those guys because they realize those guys are super smart. But then he says, yeah, but whenever they get around little kids, or whenever they get around women, these guys just talk their butts off because they know they can convince these people of everything. And so Celsus seems to think that women and children are on the same level, right? And that they're just as ignorant as the blue-collar workers. Again, I'm not saying that I agree with any of this stuff. I'm simply saying that this is what they believed back then, and that's going to be important to what we're ultimately going to be talking about in regards to all this stuff. Let's talk about still another example. This is from Strabo. Most of those who live in the cities are incited to emulation by the myths that are pleasing. When they hear the poets narrate mythical deeds of heroism, such as the labors of Heracles or Theseus, or hear of honors bestowed by gods, or indeed when they see paintings or primitive images or works of sculpture, which suggest any similar happy issue of fortune in mythology. But they are deterred from evil courses when, either through descriptions or through typical representations of objects unseen, they learn of divine punishments, terrors, and threats, or even when they merely believe that men have met with such experiences. For in dealing with a crowd of women at least, or with any promiscuous mob, a philosopher cannot influence them by reason or exhort them to reverence, piety, and faith. Nay, there is need of religious fear also, and this cannot be aroused without myths and marvels. For thunderbolt, aegis, trident, torches, snakes, thyrsus, lances, arms of the gods are myths, and so is the entire ancient theology. So what this guy, Strabo, is saying, he's saying there's two types of people in the world. There's the men, and there's the women, which I think we would agree with that part. But how he presents them are two different people. He says, if you want to motivate a man, you need to tell him a motivating story of a man who has accomplished great deeds so that you'll pump the man up and make him feel like he could go and accomplish it himself. Right? And he lists out examples such as Hercules or Theseus. But if you're a dude in the room and if you've ever seen a Rocky movie, you'll know exactly what Strabo's saying. Right? If you watch a Rocky movie as a man and you see that training montage start, all of a sudden, you're like, I gotta go work out. Right? But what he's saying is true. Right? That's how men are motivated. Right? If they see an example of a man living to the highest potential, all of a sudden we're like, yeah, that's me. I'm going to go out there. I'm going to be Hercules. Right? This is why we love movies like James Bond and John Wick and stuff, because we look at that and we're like, yeah, that's what it means to be a man. Right? It's silly, but he's saying that's how men are motivated. Or he says that sometimes if you really want to motivate men, you have to put the fear of God into them. And you've got to, like, if you're going to appeal to them from a religious perspective, well, what you have to do is you have to appeal to them from fear, right? You've got to talk about the judgment of God and the punishment for sin and the different terrors that would come if you sin against God. So he says that's how you motivate men. But he says women, they cannot be manipulated by such extreme and intense measures, right? You can't speak reason to them. From his perspective, those other things are reasonable, right? For the men, you're setting an ideal for them, right? An ideal to strive for, or a god to avoid. That's reasonable. He says for women, they don't listen to reason. They don't think logically. They simply think emotionally, right? And so he says, if you're trying to get to a woman, you stand no chance because they just don't get it. And so it's safe to say that he, in general, doesn't think very highly of women. And you can also see that he associates women with a promiscuous mob, right? What does promiscuous mob mean?
I know the mob part.
What does promiscuity mean? Promiscuous.
Nothing to do with like. I had something
Contagious.
Not contagious.
I'm
Promiscuous.
guessing.
flattery.
It just means you're going around living in sin, right?
Oh, yeah.
Usually it has more of like a sexual like idea to it, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? So he says, in dealing with a crowd of women, at least, or with any promiscuous mob. So he says that women belong to promiscuous mob because he just views them basically as equal to just wicked people who don't know how to think, right? You can't appeal to a promiscuous mob by having them chase after an ideal because sinners aren't chasing after like righteous examples. They're just living for their flesh, right? You can't appeal to a promiscuous mob by talking about punishment for sin because they don't care about punishment for crime, right? They're just going out and serving themselves. He says, same thing with women. Again, I have to clarify. I do not agree with these things. That's simply what they're saying back then. So that's in the Greco-Roman world. When you get to the Jewish world, you actually have the same exact thing going on, right? A number of Jewish sources dating after the time of the New Testament indicates that Jewish culture likewise shared a lower view of women. This is going to be relevant for us, and you'll see why in a little bit. This comes from Josephus. We've talked about Josephus. Y'all know who he is, right? Right? This was the first century historian who did a lot of just really significant things. Okay, this is what he says. But let not a single witness be credited, but 3 or 2 at the least, and those such whose testimony is confirmed by their good lives. But let not the testimony of women be admitted, on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. Nor let servants be admitted to give testimony on account of the ignobility of their soul, since it is probably that they may not speak the truth, either out of hope of gain or fear of punishment. So, what Josephus is talking about here is whose testimony should be accepted in court, right? He says, let not a single witness be credited, but 3 or 2 at least, right? And these people have to be people who have had a good reputation before themselves, right? You don't just ask criminals to come in and give a testimony, because why would you trust them, right? But at least 2 people, ideally 3. And that's based off of the Old Testament, right? If you go back to the Torah, what does it say? How many witnesses do you need?
2 or 3.
2 or 3. Yeah, right? On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, anything shall be founded, right? That's what the Torah says. That's what Josephus is saying. He says, 1 witness is not enough, 3 is ideal, 2 is okay, but only if they have good credit. But then he says, let not the testimony of women be admitted. And he says the reason why is because their sex, like their gender, is just untrustworthy. He says, on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. He says, you just cannot trust women. Again, I'm not saying that Josephus is correct. I'm simply saying that's what he said. And then he puts women on the same category as servants. Nor let servants be admitted to give testimony on account of the ignobility of their soul. Right? So he says women can't be trusted because, in general, their gender is just not a trustworthy gender. And then he says slaves can't be trusted because they have too many ulterior motives that could lead them to lie. Right? Because since they are slaves, they might be lying to gain something, or they might be lying to avoid punishment or something, right? So he basically says testimonies have to come from 2 or 3 men of good standing. But women, don't listen to them. Which in general says that they had a lower view of women. Alright? This is from Rosh Hashanah 1:8. Okay, yeah. So, the following are unfit to give testimony, as they are considered thieves and robbers. One who plays with dice, or another, or other games of chance or money, and those who lend money with interest, and those who raise pigeons and place wagers on the outcome, and merchants who deal in produce of the sabbatical year, which may be eaten, but may not be an object of commerce, and slaves. This is the principle. Any testimony for which a woman is unfit, these 2 are unfit. Although in certain cases a woman's testimony is accepted, such as to testify to the death of someone's husband, in the majority of cases, her testimony is not valid. Right? So this is from the Talmud, and the Jewish people are saying, in general, a woman's testimony is not valid. When is one of the few examples it says that a woman's testimony is valid? It listed it right there.
Oh, in blue?
No.
Oh.
I'm just trying to see if y'all are listening.
Of the levity and boldness of their sex.
No. To testify to the death of someone's husband. Right? So if her husband dies, she can testify to that. Right? But in general, it says a woman's testimony isn't to be trusted. And do you notice who he puts women on equal standing with here? What type of people does he describe at the very beginning of that statement?
They're considered thieves and robbers.
Yeah, criminals. Right? He says criminals should not be trusted. And he says, just as a general standing, if you wouldn't trust a woman for this judgment, don't trust a criminal. That's pretty crazy. Right? So he's basically saying that from a legal perspective, women and criminals were treated the same. To be clear here, this is not the same as what the Greco-Romans were saying. Right? With the Greco-Romans, they genuinely just seem to have a much lower view of women in general. In a Jewish perspective, it was specifically in regards to the law, right, and legality stuff. But that's going to be relevant to what we're talking about in the Gospels. Right? I know some of this might sound kind of boring, but you'll understand why it's relevant a little bit. Here's another example, right? Sota 19a. Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to a woman. Yikes. That's pretty messed up, huh? All right, next one. This is from Kiddushin 82b. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, there is no trade that disappears from the world, since all occupations are needed. But fortunate is he who sees his parents in an elevated trade. Woe is he who sees his parents in a lowly trade and follows them into the trade. Similarly, it is impossible for the world to continue without a perfumer and without a tanner. Fortunate is he whose trade is as a perfumer, and woe is he whose trade is as a tanner, who works with materials that have a foul smell. Likewise, it is impossible for the world to exist without males and without females. Yet fortunate is he whose children are males, and woe is he whose children are females.
Really?
Are you serious?
Yikes. So he says, man, basically he says, we need men and women to keep the world going around, but having a boy is way better than having a girl. It's kind of messed up a little bit.
At the very end, you'd think it was just going to be a normal thing.
Yeah. So I like to be as fair as possible here, and I'd like to think that maybe he's being a little bit sarcastic here. Because the thing is, there is a way where you can say this and it's not outright anti-woman. And it's something that I would actually agree with a little bit whenever I think about having kids in the future. To me, the idea of having a boy sounds a lot better than having a girl. And that's mainly because, as a guy myself, I think it'd be easier to raise up a boy and hold him accountable. Whereas if I was raising up a girl, I would never trust her with another guy. And I would not know what to do when it comes to raising a girl. Right? With a guy, so if you think about it from that perspective, I kind of get where he's coming from. I think he's probably just being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and he's kind of just joking around. And he's saying, fortunate is he whose children are males, woe is he whose children are females, in the sense of, if you got a boy as a kid, it's a lot easier for you as a man, right? If that makes sense. I could be wrong there. I might just be trying to be a little bit too, I might be trying to help them out a little bit too much, but that's what I like to assume. Now, before we actually get to why this is all relevant, I want to see if y'all can figure out, why is all this stuff relevant to our discussion of the gospel accounts? Why is it important for us to know that in general, the Greco-Roman and Jewish worlds alike had a lower view of women?
Because then I think if the story was made up or something. Wait.
You're on the right track.
If the story was made up, then they would say men went to the tomb.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly it. Right? If this story is being made up, why would you say that women found the tomb empty? Because that's not going to convince anybody. Right? So, it goes back to the criterion of embarrassment.
Yes.
Right? Remember the criterion of embarrassment? The idea that you are, if something is embarrassing to you or it doesn't add credibility to what you're saying, you're less likely to report it. And if you do report it, it's more likely to be true. Since the New Testament was written in a Greco-Roman and Jewish world, the criterion of embarrassment renders the central role of women in the gospel accounts as more likely to be historical. Right? So y'all get exactly why that is, right? All right. So, it seems unlikely that the evangelists would fabricate narratives or existing testimonies to make women the first witnesses of the empty tomb and resurrected Jesus if that was not what they actually remembered. Right? For instance, let's suggest that Peter was the one who found the tomb empty. Do you not think that they would have reported that? That would be a lot more credible from their perspective. Right? But that's not what they reported. Right? If they reported anything else, it would make more sense for them to report that. They literally gain nothing by saying it was women, because if you say that it's a woman, if anything, you're going to turn people away from believing, right? A lot of people, they might have read the gospel accounts and they might have been buying into this whole thing, and then all of a sudden, by saying women came and found the tomb empty, you just discredited yourself. And so it's actually ironic if you think about it, because what was discrediting back in the first century actually is evidence for the genuineness of it now. Because since we have evidence that people had a lower view of women, for us now, we can look and we say, that's awesome, right? Because it's not just one account that says that. All 4 gospel accounts tell us women found the tomb empty. And we'll talk, it gets even better than that. If they were fabricating the stories in order to gain credibility, why not depict men as being the first witnesses? Prestigious men such as Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus, no less. Right? If you're simply making this up, give yourself credibility. Right? Don't make it women. Right? Because you're not going to gain any favors there. Right? All you're going to do is make it to where people are more skeptical. Right? Why would you do that to yourself? Right? If you're going to fabricate something, make it a worthwhile fabrication. Get somebody in on the lie who you know will fabricate it for you. right? Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, they were secret converts, right? Get them to agree to be part of the lie, right? But if you're going to fabricate it, don't make it women. But the fact that they did say that women found the empty tomb would suggest that they weren't fabricating anything at all. They were simply recording what actually happened, right? Their goal was not to fabricate stuff. Their goal was simply to record what happened. And so they didn't want to say Peter found the tomb empty if it wasn't Peter, right? Every single one of them mentions that Mary Magdalene was there. And then some of them mentioned that other women were there too. That would seem to suggest that that's actually what happened. Especially if you think about the fact that Mary Magdalene is not a prominent person, right? It's not like they gave it to, like they could have said Mary, the mother of Jesus, right? She's at least more prominent. Mary Magdalene, she literally shows up at one other point in the Gospels, and it's literally just to be mentioned that she had 7 demons cast out of her. That's it. She's not even, why would you make it her, right? Of all people, right? Why would you choose her to be the one to find the empty tomb unless she was simply the actual person who found it? Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. It gets even better, though. The way the rest of the New Testament handles the testimonies of the witnesses actually goes on to support this, right? 1 Corinthians 15. I've told you that you're going to get tired of hearing this passage, but it's super relevant. The women witnesses are not mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, which predates any of the gospel narratives. The same is true of charismatic summaries in the book of Acts. So 1 Corinthians 15. Remember, this is, I'm going to read it again in a second. But we quoted this last week. Do you remember what I said, how early we could possibly date this teaching to? 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Corinthians itself dates to the early 50s AD. Yeah. But do you remember this particular section? I said that it dated really close to the time of Christ. Do you remember what it was?
30.
So it was in the AD 30s, right? So it was within a few years, right?
Yeah.
So Jesus died AD 30 to 33, and people speculate that this probably dates to AD 35-ish. That's really cool. But, and we'll talk about a little bit more significance to that in a second. But what I want you to notice is that there are no women mentioned in this text. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. After that he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all to one untimely born he appeared to me also. So, does Paul mention women at all in there? No. And that actually makes sense. Because think about it. When you read the gospel accounts, they're not trying to defend whether or not Jesus resurrected, right? The gospel accounts are simply reporting the historical event itself, right? It's like the difference between, it's the difference between you watching a movie and then writing an essay about the movie, right? When you watch the movie, you're simply watching the events unfold. Whenever you write an essay about the movie, you're choosing certain things to highlight to prove a point that you're arguing. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so in the gospel accounts, they're simply saying what happened, right? They're saying, okay, women showed up at the tomb, they found the tomb empty, and then yada, yada, yada. In 1 Corinthians 15, though, Paul is quoting an early church teaching which was specifically recited to defend the resurrection of Jesus, right? It says that he died according to the Scriptures, right? So his death was in accordance with the Old Testament Scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, right? So all of this is apologetic, right? He's defending the faith, right? His death, fulfillment of prophecy. His burial and resurrection, fulfillment of prophecy. And then he begins to cite people that Jesus appeared to. Who does he start off with first? Cephas. Who is Cephas? Peter, yes.
Peter?
Yes. Cephas is Peter, right? So Peter is the Greek form of the name. Cephas is the Aramaic form. They both mean the rock, right? So he showed up to Peter first. Why would he list Peter first?
He was the leader.
Peter was the leader. That rhymes. Yeah, Peter was the leader of the apostles, right? And so it makes sense that you would mention Peter first. And then who does he mention that Jesus appeared to?
500.
Not yet.
To 12.
The 12. Okay, who are the 12?
The disciples.
The disciples of Jesus. Like the 12 people that he specifically appointed to, give birth to the church. Now, to be fair, we know that at this point, Jesus only appeared to 11 of them, right? Because Judas Iscariot was not amongst this group. But the fact that they are referred to as the 12 shows that it's not talking about the actual number of them, it's talking about the title that they are known as. Right? They were known as the 12. Right? And that's why after Judas leaves, they end up appointing another person. Right? And so he appears to Cephas, the leader of them. He appears to all 12 of them. And then who does he appear to?
James?
Nope.
More than
Or did you
500
like-
brothers.
More than 500 brothers at one time.
52 already talked
Right?
about this.
No, 500 Christians. Why would he highlight that one?
All those people can give a testimony to it.
That's a lot of people. Right? And so, once again, all of these serve the purpose of defending the faith. Right? Then he appeared to James. Well, the reason why you would list James is because James became the leader of the Jerusalem church. And then lastly, he appeared to Paul himself. Well, that makes sense because Paul himself is the one writing. And so Paul lists this out specifically to defend the faith. And because he is going about defending the faith, who does he leave out? Who have we been talking about this whole time?
The women.
The women. Because Paul recognizes that listing the women here would not add anything to the testimony. Right? If Paul's purpose is to defend the faith, why add the women in there? Because we know that from a Greco-Roman perspective and a Jewish perspective, women's testimonies were not viewed as valid. And so Paul doesn't feel the need to include them there because his primary purpose is to defend the faith. But this is where it gets even better. Because like I said, Paul is quoting a teaching that dates to within a few years of the time of Christ. The Gospels were written after this teaching. And many people speculate that the Gospels were actually written after 1 Corinthians was written. And so consider this logic. Why would the Gospels, likely written after 1 Corinthians and well after the teachings which Corinthians hands down, fabricate a story wherein women rather than the disciples are the first witnesses of the resurrected Jesus? They wouldn't gain anything from that. Right? Because Paul himself has already given a testimony of who Jesus appeared to. If the Gospels were simply making a story up, you know who you would show Jesus appearing to? These guys, right? You would say Jesus showed up, and Peter's the one who found the empty tomb, and then Jesus appears to the 12, and then you would detail that Jesus showed up to 500 people at one time, and you would detail all those because those are testimonies that would actually give credibility to the story. But that's not what the Gospel writers do. Instead, the Gospel writers, writing later on, they write a story wherein women find the empty tomb. So, if anything, it seems like they're trying to discredit this stuff. Or they're simply recounting the details how they actually happened. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And it's even cooler. We're going to talk about this next week when it comes to the independent accounts. But of all these different appearances, which one is the one that you find the most interesting?
More than 500 brothers.
I'd say so, right? More than 500 people at one time? Don't you kind of want to know that story? But guess what? This is the only place it's ever mentioned in the Bible.
Wow.
Which is weird, because it's such an early teaching. If somebody were fabricating this whole thing, wouldn't you think that they would, take an opportunity to make up something about that? Because that's a cool story. But nobody ever mentions it. Which would seem to suggest that the early church was not about just making up stories to fabricate things. They were simply reporting things as they were. And so apparently he did show up to 500 people at one time. We just don't know when, or where. That's kind of cool. We'll talk about that again later. Right? The main thing I'm highlighting here is that whenever you're actually just looking at this together, it would seem to suggest that the gospel authors are just recording what actually happened. The women are given the primary mission of informing the men, not the world, whenever you actually look into the gospels themselves. This reflects a status below that of the male disciples. Real quick, let's just go look at those accounts. Right? I've got the references there. Matthew chapter 28, verse 7. So this is where the angel is speaking. He is not here, for he has risen, just as he said. Come see the place where he is lying. And go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you. So, according to the angel, what is the mission of the women? What are they supposed to go do?
I'm trying to find
Can't
it
tell the
still.
disciples.
Go tell the disciples. Right? Notice that the angels do not seem to have this expectation that the women are going to be the ones to take the gospel to the end of the world. Because they know that the women's testimonies are not typically considered valid. They are given a much smaller mission. go let the disciples know what you've seen. And then the disciples are going to come see it for themselves, and Jesus will appear to them. Mark chapter 16, verse 7. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. Right? In the Gospel of Mark, it specifically mentions Peter as well. All right? Going to Luke chapter 24. Oh, there's a typo there.
There is?
It's supposed to say Luke 24, 10 through 12, not 120 through 12.
Is that even a real verse?
Yeah. Luke 24. Now Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the rest of the women with them were there. They were telling these things to the apostles. But these words appeared to them as nonsense, and they were not believing them. Notice that. The women go and tell this to the disciples, and how do the disciples respond?
They don't believe it.
They don't believe. They do not believe the testimony of women. But Peter stood up and ran to the tomb, and stooping to look in, he saw the linen wrappings only. And he went away by himself, marveling at what had happened. Right? And so the women go and report to the disciples, but the disciples do not believe their testimony until they go and check for themselves. That lets you know that the apostles probably weren't that different than the other people at that time period. To be fair, in general, if somebody says that, even if like 30 people come up to you saying somebody resurrected, you're probably not going to believe them at first. We know the same thing's going to be true with Thomas. But let's go to John chapter 20 real quick. And let's look at that. John chapter 20. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark, and saw the stone already taken away from the tomb. So she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to him, They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. So once again, every single one of the four Gospels, they report that on Sunday morning, a group of women found the tomb empty. And every single one of those reports that the women proceeded to go and tell the disciples about this. Right? And 3 of those Gospels explicitly say that that was the job they were given. Right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke say, go tell the disciples. Right? That is your mission. That is your job. Their job is not to go and do the same thing the disciples did. Right? The disciples, their job was to go out to the world and testify. But if a bunch of women were doing it, in general, the church probably would not have expanded as speedily, because their testimony would not have been viewed as valid, if that makes sense. Further, even after Jesus appears to the male disciples, some were incredulous. We already read some of this, right? But, okay, this is pretty crazy. Right? Real quick, I just want to show you something. This is wild. Everybody flip to Matthew 28 if you've got your Bible.
Matthew 28. Sounds familiar.
28 verse what?
Verses 16 and 17. Now, don't read it yet, but just looking at those verses, what do you notice? Just looking at them. Don't read it. Just looking. What's the first thing you notice?
The font.
Uh-huh.
Is your question like what did he tell them to do?
No, because I don't want you to read it yet. Just looking at it. You see where verses 16 to 17 are. What do you notice about where it's at in the gospel?
At the end.
At the very end. Right? We are literally, there are only 20 verses in Matthew chapter 28. Verses 16 and 17, those are the 5th and 4th to last verses in the gospel. The only thing that follows these verses is the Great Commission. But it says this, But the 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had designated. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. The Gospel of Matthew literally ends with some people doubting what they're seeing. And when it says some people, who's it talking about? Who are the only people there?
The disciples.
The 11 disciples, right? These are the apostles. Most likely when it says some doubted, who's it chiefly probably got in mind?
Thomas.
Probably Thomas, right? We know that from the Gospel of John. But notice that. Some of them doubted, and this is at the very end. Literally, when you go on after that, it says, And Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of the nations. So the Gospel ends, and the last thing we see the disciples doing is doubting. That doesn't look very good, does it? So now you've got a Gospel that reports that women found the tomb empty, and then that some of the men were doubting what was happening. And then it just ends. Does it seem like Matthew's goal was to defend that the resurrection happened? If so, he's doing a really bad job of it. Because the people who were the least credible are the ones who find the tomb, and the people who should have been the most confident are the ones who are doubting. So if Matthew's whole goal is to create a lie that convinces you to believe in the resurrection, he's doing a really bad job at it. Because literally the people who are the founders of the church, the last thing we see them doing are doubting. That's not the best way to get your movement started. However, if Matthew is simply recording what actually happened, that makes more sense, right? Maybe his goal was not apologetic, right? He wasn't trying to prove the resurrection happened. He was simply recording what actually occurred. And the reason he said that women found the tomb empty is not because he was trying to convince you it happened. It's just because that's what happened. And the reason he says that men doubted is not because he's trying to convince you that it happened. It's just because they doubted, right? Matthew is acting as a historian, not as an apologist. He's simply recording the details. Luke chapter 24. Now Mary Magdalene and Joanna, the mother of James, and the rest of the women were with them there, and they were telling these things to the apostles. But these words appeared to them as nonsense, and they were not believing in them. Right? This is the same passage I quoted earlier. So in every single one of these accounts, the women go report to the men, and how do the men respond? Disbelief. John chapter 20, y'all are familiar with this. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus. Oh, it's Amazon. It's fine. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were saying to him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the imprint of his nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." So whenever you look at Matthew, Luke, and John, all of them present the disciples as doubting. And I'm pretty sure when you go to Mark, you actually see something like that too. The reason I probably did not include Mark's on here is because the ending of Mark, there's some stuff about it that's debated. But whenever you go to Mark, we read this. This is the angels talking to the women. "But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment were gripping them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And according to our best understanding, that's how the Gospel of Mark originally ended. It just ends with the women running away and not reporting anything to anybody because they're just afraid. But we do have a longer ending that most likely somebody added on a little bit later. Now, after he had arisen early on the first day of the week, he first appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and reported to those who had been with him while they were mourning and crying. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they refused to believe it. So, every single one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all record that on Sunday morning, women discovered an empty tomb. They also all record that when the women told the men refused to believe it, which is consistent with the human experience, right? If you are told that somebody resurrected, you're probably not going to believe it, especially if you know that they died a death by crucifixion. But it's also consistent with what we see culturally speaking at this time period, that women's testimonies were not trusted as readily as men's, even if there were multiple, right? And so whenever you look at all of this, it does not look like the gospel authors are fabricating a story. It simply looks like they are reporting what actually did happen. And therefore, this is what Mike Licona says. "Thus there is a double embarrassment factor present. Since the women serve as both witnesses and as the recipients of divine revelation, while the men are presented as thick-headed. These are not the kind of reports one invents in order to boost confidence in church leadership." Right? If you're wanting to build confidence in the church, you do not say that women discovered the tomb empty. And if you're wanting to build confidence in the church, you do not say that the leaders of the church did not believe that the resurrection happened at first. The only reason you report those things is that they actually happened. Because both of those are very, very embarrassing. And they make the women look good, and they make the men look bad. And the men are the ones who are leading the church, not the women. Right? And so all of that together leads us to this ultimate and final conclusion, and this is where we're going to end today. And so we're going to end early. The reason for the report's lack of credibility in the first century is a reason for its credibility in the 21st century. Accordingly, the most plausible explanations for the inclusion of women witnesses in the resurrection narratives is that the remembrance of the tradition was so strong and widespread that it had to be included. The embarrassment factor weighs quite heavily in favor of the history of the appearance of the women, and counter arguments simply carry too little weight. And so that is why, amongst our 5 bedrock facts, ladies discovering an empty tomb is one of them. Right? So practically everybody agrees that Jesus died. What was the first one? He died a death by crucifixion. And now the second one, and I'm going to be drilling y'all on these because I want y'all to remember them. Right? Like if somebody were to ever ask you, why are you a Christian? I want you to say, because I believe we have historical evidence that Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead. And they'll say, well, why do you say that? And you'll say, I can give you 5 good reasons right now. Right? And I want you to say, boom, 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 boom. Right? And if you got those 5 reasons, there you go. And then, the reason I'm giving you all this background stuff is because I want you to be able to defend it.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't expect you to remember all of this, but that's why we're spending like 2 hours on each one. If I can teach you 2 hours worth, maybe you can remember 5 minutes of each. Right? And so, the first one, death by crucifixion. Right? All because he died a death by crucifixion does not prove that he resurrected. It simply proves that he died, which is necessary in order to resurrect. Right? So that one's good. Secondly, we believe that ladies discovered the empty tomb. That does not prove that he resurrected. It simply proves that now you have to account for the body. Right? If he died, now you have to figure out, where did that body go? Right? Was the body stolen? That's possible. Right? Did the tomb spontaneously combust? Right? Did the body disintegrate overnight? Right? Those things could all possibly happen, but you have to follow the historical evidence, right? And you have to somehow explain why one theory is to be favored over the other, right? And so those 2 things that we've talked about so far, those don't prove the resurrection happened. Those are simply things that we can agree did happen, and each fact ultimately will work together to, I think, prove that the resurrection did happen, right? Next week, we are going to go into fact number 3, independent appearances after death, right? Ultimately, just to foreshadow where we're heading, we have several different people in Scripture who claim to have seen the risen Jesus. Again, that does not prove that they did. It simply proves that they believed that they did, right? There's a distinction to be made there, right? Now what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to explain, how did all these people claim that, right? It's one thing if Peter claims it, but it's another thing if James, the brother of Jesus, claims it. And it's another thing if 500 people at one time claim it. Because you could argue that it was a hallucination, but what type of drugs did they have in the first century so that 500 people could have the same hallucination? Right? And so each of these is going to, once again, none of them work in isolation. But all 5 together, I think, will give you very good evidence that Jesus did resurrect. Sound good?
Yes.
All right. Does one of y'all want to close this out in prayer?
I'll do it.
All right.
Lord, thank you for this information we've studied today, and please allow us to take it in the right way and use it in the way that you intended us to use it. And allow us to defend the faith in a way that pleases you and blesses us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.